Imagine waking up one morning and 20% of the world's oil simply stops moving. No warning, no declaration, no visible army crossing any border, just silence where there used to be the sound of tankers. That is not a hypothetical. That is a scenario the United States military has war-gamed hundreds of times. And in the spring of 2025, something happened in the Strait of Hormuz that brought that scenario closer to reality than most people will ever be told. This is not a story about missiles. It is not a story about ships. It is a story about what was hidden beneath the surface of one of the most watched and most dangerous waterways on the planet, and about what happens when one of the world's most powerful militaries decides it has seen enough. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. 21 miles. That is less than the distance from one end of a major city to the other. And through that gap moves 17 million barrels of oil every single day. 1/5 of the world's entire petroleum supply. The economies of Japan, South Korea, India, China, all of Europe, they all breathe through this narrow corridor. Choke it, and you don't just stop tankers. You stop factories, you stop hospitals, you stop cities, you stop everything. Iran has always known this. For decades, their military doctrine has been built around one brutal truth. They cannot defeat the United States in a conventional war. They don't have to. All they have to do is threaten that strait. All they have to do is make the cost of intervention too high. All they have to do is convince the world that the waterway cannot be protected. And for that strategy, they needed something hidden. Something that couldn't be seen from a satellite, something that didn't show up on radar until it was already too late. What they built was not a fleet. What they built was a labyrinth. Beneath the surface of the Persian Gulf, along the rocky coastal shelves that border the Iranian shoreline, engineers and military planners had been laying a network for years. Fiber optic cables, acoustic sensors, passive sonar arrays, underwater communication nodes, and connected to all of it, dispersed, camouflaged, embedded in the geography of the seabed itself, were weapons, mines that didn't look like mines, launch systems that didn't look like launch systems. Command and control infrastructure that had been deliberately buried, scattered, and hardened against the kind of precision airstrikes that ended Saddam Hussein's military in 72 hours. They called it, in the language of American intelligence analysts studying it, a layered denial architecture. In simpler terms, a trap. A trap designed to survive the first strike, respond to the second, and make the third unthinkable. And the Americans were watching all of it. Not all at once, not with perfect clarity. Intelligence is never perfect. But over months and years, a picture was assembled from satellite imagery, signals intercepts, human intelligence, and the data returned by undersea surveillance systems that the US Navy has been quietly deploying across the Persian Gulf floor since the 1990s. The picture that emerged was alarming, not because Iran was building something new, because they were finishing something old, and finishing it at a pace that suggested a timeline. When a nation moves from building a capability to completing it, something changes in the strategic calculus. A half-built threat is a future problem. A finished one is a present one. By late 2024, American commanders were being briefed on an architecture that had crossed a threshold. The underwater network was not just complete in theory. Elements of it were being activated, tested, integrated. The sensors were talking to the command nodes were talking to the weapons, and the weapons, dispersed across the approaches to the strait, were now potentially functional in ways they had not been 18 months before. This is the part that never makes it into the news cycle. The activation is the signal, not the weapon itself. Not the act of aggression. The moment when a hidden system goes from dormant to operational is the moment the clock starts. The clock started, and someone in Washington decided they were not going to wait for it to run out. Think about what it takes to strike something you cannot fully see. Something that has been deliberately hidden in an environment that defeats radar, complicates satellite surveillance, and punishes surface vessels that come too close. Something that is not a building, not a base, not a column of armor moving across open desert. Something that exists as a distributed system, 10 nodes, 20 nodes, 50, spread across hundreds of square kilometers of ocean floor. This is where the United States military's investment in the last 2 decades reveals itself. Because what was about to happen in the Strait of Hormuz was not a conventional strike. It was an operation that required capabilities most countries on Earth simply do not have. And it unfolded in layers that the public would only ever see fragments of. The first layer was signals. Before a single weapon is employed, the battlefield is mapped. Every emission, every ping from an active sonar system, every radio frequency burst, every encrypted transmission traveling through the fiber optic nodes had been logged, analyzed, and geolocated. The electronic signature of the network had been reconstructed not from a single intercept, but from thousands of them, gathered over months, assembled by algorithms and analysts working around the clock. By the time the operation was authorized, American planners knew where the nodes were, not with the certainty of a surveyor, but with enough confidence to act. The second layer was undersea. The United States Navy operates a class of capabilities in this domain that are almost never discussed publicly. Unmanned underwater vehicles, long-duration autonomous systems capable of operating for weeks without surfacing. Some are surveillance platforms, some are not. What happened in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf in the weeks before the visible strikes were recorded is a chapter that may never be fully declassified. But the pattern of subsequent Iranian behavior, the frantic attempts to locate and neutralize systems that were already inside their defensive perimeter, tells a story even without the classified details. The third layer was air. And this is where the public record begins. When the B-2 Spirit crossed into the operational theater, it was not alone. It is never alone. The aircraft that carries the massive ordnance penetrator, a 30,000-pound weapon designed to destroy hardened underground targets, does not operate without an architecture of support that makes its mission possible. Electronic jamming platforms that suppress Iranian radar before the aircraft arrives. Fighter escorts operating on the outer perimeter, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets feeding real-time updates to the crew, and below all of that, surface and subsurface naval forces positioned to respond to any Iranian attempt at escalation. This is not an airstrike. This is an ecosystem. The targets the B-2S were assigned to were not the obvious ones. Every military analyst, every Iranian commander, every government watching from a safe distance knew about the uranium enrichment facilities at Fordo and Natanz. Those were expected. What was not expected? What the Iranians had believed was safe precisely because it was hidden were the coastal infrastructure nodes that tied their denial system together. The processing centers dug into cliff faces along the Gulf Coast, the hardened communication relays that controlled the underwater network, the power infrastructure feeding the sensors, the physical backbone of the system that made the trap a trap. Without those nodes, the sensors go dark. Without the sensors, the weapons are blind. Without the command and control links, the entire layered architecture becomes a collection of inert hardware scattered across a seabed with no one able to activate it. The trap was not destroyed, it was blinded. There is a difference, and that difference is deliberate. A destroyed system is gone. A blinded system still exists. Its physical components still present, still potentially recoverable, but it is operationally dead. It cannot be used. It cannot be activated. It cannot fulfill the purpose it was built for. And the message carried by that distinction is a surgical one. This was not an act of erasure. This was a demonstration of reach, of precision, of the ability to enter the most defended space in Iran's strategic architecture and turn off the lights without collapsing the walls. The Iranian response was exactly what had been predicted: chaotic, dispersed, and ultimately ineffective. Missiles were fired, not at the B-2s. Those were already gone back across the horizon. Invisible to every system Iran operates, missiles were fired at the naval formation in the Gulf. They were met by the layered air defense systems of the carrier strike group, destroyers running Aegis, cruisers running SM-3, close-in weapon systems as a final layer. Of the missiles launched, the publicly available assessment suggests a defense rate that rounds to total. None reached their intended targets. Drones were deployed. The swarm tactics that Iran has developed, designed to overwhelm point defense systems by sheer volume, were applied against a formation that had been specifically configured to handle them. Directed energy systems, electronic countermeasures, fighter aircraft on combat air patrol above the formation. The drone swarm was absorbed. And then silence, not peace, not resolution, not the end of anything. Just the specific silence that follows a demonstration of force that was calibrated not to annihilate, but to communicate. Let's be honest about what you're watching right now. If you've made it this far into this video, you are not a casual observer. You understand that what happened in the Strait of Hormuz is not a story with a clean ending. You understand that this is a chapter, not a conclusion. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think happens next. Does Iran rebuild? Does this deter the next escalation? Or did the American strike simply move the timeline without changing the destination? I read every serious comment. The conversation in this section matters. Now let's talk about what the world missed. Because while every camera was pointed at the explosions, three things were happening simultaneously that almost no outlet covered. The first was the market. In the 72 hours following the initial strikes, oil futures moved in a pattern that told a different story than the one being broadcast. Prices spiked, as expected. But they did not sustain the spike. By the end of the week, they had returned to within 4% of pre-strike levels. The market had looked at what happened, calculated the damage to actual throughput, and decided that the strait was still open. Because it was. The operation had been designed specifically to preserve the strait's function while eliminating the threat to it. The invisible war had been fought to protect the very flow of commerce it was conducted around. Commodity markets priced that outcome in within days. That is not chaos. That is a surgical outcome. The second was China. Beijing's response to the strike was not the condemnation most expected. It was measured, restrained. The official statement called for de-escalation, standard language, but notably did not call for the withdrawal of American forces from the region. Privately, Chinese energy officials were being briefed by their own intelligence services on the damage assessment. China imports approximately 45% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. A functional Iran-controlled denial architecture in that waterway is not in Beijing's interest regardless of their geopolitical alignment with Tehran. The American strike removed a threat to Chinese energy security as surely as it removed a threat to American force projection. That shared interest does not create friendship. But it creates a kind of operational parallelism that shaped the diplomatic aftermath. The third was the nuclear question, because the strikes on Fordow and Natanz, the enrichment facilities the entire world had been watching, produced an assessment that no one was entirely prepared for. The damage was significant. Centrifuge cascades were destroyed. Hardened tunnel infrastructure was compromised, but the program was not eliminated. The knowledge was not lost. The scientists were not gone. A nuclear program is not a building. You can strike a building. You can delay a program. You cannot bomb away expertise. And the debate that erupted in the weeks following the strike, among proliferation analysts, among former weapons inspectors, among the architects of the original Iran nuclear deal, centered on a single uncomfortable question. Did the strike set the timeline back by 2 years, 5 years, or did it accelerate the incentive to move faster and deeper underground? There is no clean answer to that question. There is never a clean answer to questions like that. That is the nature of strategic decisions made under conditions of incomplete information and irreversible consequence. You can be right about the threat, you can execute the operation flawlessly, and you can still be looking at a problem that is harder to solve the day after you struck it than it was the day before. Not because you failed. Because the adversary adapts. Because the system that was built once can be rebuilt. Because the intent that generated the system in the first place, the geopolitical and existential logic driving Iran's strategic behavior, was not destroyed by a massive ordnance penetrator. It was not even touched by one. This is the part that the cinematic version of these events always omits. The strike is not the end of the story. The strike is the moment when the story becomes harder. 30 years ago, the United States was the only country on Earth with the ability to project this kind of power at this kind of range against this kind of target. One B-2 Spirit flying from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri to a target in Iran and back, a round trip of over 15,000 miles, was a demonstration that no other nation could replicate. Today, that gap has narrowed, not disappeared, narrowed. China is testing long-range stealth aircraft. Russia has rebuilt portions of its strategic bomber fleet. The proliferation of drone technology has handed a version of precision strike capability to actors that 20 years ago had none. The world in which American military dominance was so overwhelming that it never needed to be used is giving way to a world where it must be used precisely because it is being challenged. And the Strait of Hormuz, that 21-mile gap through which 1/5 of the world's oil still moves every single day, sits at the center of that transition. It is not just a waterway, it is a test. A recurring test of whether the order that was built over the last 80 years, at enormous cost, can be maintained against the pressure of states and systems that are betting it cannot. Iran made a bet in the waters of the Persian Gulf. They built something patient and hidden and designed for the long game. They believed that the accumulated deterrence of their denial architecture, the threat it posed to American ships, to Allied tankers, to the global economy itself, would constrain the response options of anyone who noticed it. They believed that the cost of action was higher than the cost of tolerance. They were wrong. The thing about hidden systems is that they are only powerful before they are understood. Once mapped, once penetrated, once tied to a target list, a hidden system stops being a threat and becomes a liability. Every node that was built, every cable that was laid, every sensor that was deployed, all of it had to be found first. Then it could be taken apart. And taking it apart was not just a military operation. It was a message. A message composed not in words, but in the specific language of precision damage, written at the bottom of the Persian Gulf and detonated inside hardened rock on the Iranian coast. The message said, "We were here before you knew we were here. We mapped what you built. We waited until the time was right. And when we acted, there was nothing you could do." That is power, not the power of an explosion. The power of access, the power of persistence, the power of an intelligence apparatus and a military machine that has spent decades learning how to operate inside someone else's most defended space without being seen until the moment it chooses to be. The strait is still open, the tankers are still moving, the oil is still flowing. The world woke up the morning after and the lights were on and the gas stations were open and the price at the pump was within a few cents of what it had been a week before. That is what a successful operation looks like. Not the fireball, not the footage, the absence of disruption, the continuation of everything that was supposed to continue. But underneath that normalcy, something has shifted. Iran must now rebuild in full awareness that what it rebuilds can be found and struck again. Its deterrent, the threat to the strait, the architecture of denial, has been shown to be penetrable. The mystique of the hidden system has been punctured, and in strategic terms, that is often more damaging than the physical damage itself, because the physical damage can be repaired, concrete can be poured, cables can be relayed. Yes, sensors can be replaced, but the confidence that the system will be unknown, unseen, and uncounterable, that does not come back easily. That takes years. And during those years, the strategic calculation looks different. That is the real outcome of what happened in the Strait of Hormuz. Not a victory, not a resolution, a reset, a demonstration, a recalibration of who understands whose capabilities and what the cost of certain decisions will be. The world is not safer in the way that the word safe usually implies. It is stable in the way that a knife held at a precise angle is stable, through applied force, maintained with effort, requiring attention and adjustment, and the constant awareness that if the force is removed or misdirected or simply insufficient, the equilibrium ends. The strait is open, for now. For as long as the force is maintained and the attention holds, and the systems that protect it remain more capable than the systems that threaten it. That is not a guarantee. It is a condition, and conditions change. The question is whether the people making decisions on all sides of this understand clearly enough what changed in those 72 hours and what didn't, to navigate what comes next without repeating the miscalculations that made the strike necessary in the first place.